An arrogant passenger mocked an older man until he realized it was Clint Eastwood. You won't believe how it ended. The boarding gate for the early morning flight from Phoenix to Los Angeles buzzed with activity. Passengers moved forward in neat lines, gripping their coffee cups and carry-ons, their expressions a mix of fatigue and focus. It was first-class boarding, where the energy felt both exclusive and restrained. Among the passengers was a man who stood out, not just for his tailored navy suit or the polished leather shoes that gleamed under the terminal's fluorescent lights, but for the way he carried himself. There was an air of superiority about him, a presence that seemed to demand attention. In his mid-40s, he had the look of someone who had spent years climbing corporate ladders, collecting accolades, and never questioning his place at the top. He wasn't just here to travel, he was here to assert his dominance, even among strangers. As he strolled toward the gate, his leather briefcase swung in perfect rhythm with his steps. His eyes flicked over the other passengers with thinly veiled disinterest. Soon, he was comfortably settled into his first-class seat, scrolling through emails on his tablet as other passengers filed in. That's when he noticed him. An older man shuffled down the aisle, carrying nothing but a small bag. His outfit didn't fit the businessman's idea of a first-class traveler: a tan jacket, a plaid shirt, and a pair of worn loafers. His face, weathered by time, held a certain calmness, the kind of serenity that comes from having seen enough of life to not be bothered by trivial things. The older man moved with quiet efficiency, settling into his seat without a fuss. He adjusted his jacket, placed his bag under the seat in front of him, and leaned back, gazing out the window. To most, he might have seemed unremarkable, a simple man, minding his own business. But to the businessman, he was an anomaly. The younger man's gaze flicked between him and the flight attendant assisting passengers. With a sly grin, he leaned over just enough to ensure the older man could hear him. "Looks like first class isn't as exclusive as it used to be," he said, with a smirk. A few heads turned, subtle reactions from nearby passengers. The older man, however, didn't flinch. He glanced briefly at the businessman, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips before he turned back to the window. The lack of response irritated the businessman. Undeterred, he added, "What's the occasion? Did they hand out charity upgrades today?" His tone was sharper this time, laced with condescension. Still, the older man didn't take the bait. He simply adjusted his seatbelt and kept his gaze fixed on the tarmac. His silence was louder than any response he could have given, and it only fueled the businessman's arrogance. As the flight attendants moved through their pre-flight checks, the businessman finally leaned back, satisfied with his attempt at humor. But as the plane began to taxi, something about the older man's calm demeanor began to gnaw at him. It wasn't just the silence, it was the quiet confidence, the unshakable sense of self, the way he carried himself, as though nothing the businessman said could touch him. It felt out of place in a world where appearances seemed to mean everything. But the businessman wasn't ready to let it go. For him, the flight was just beginning, and little did he know, so was a lesson he'd never forget. As the plane reached cruising altitude and the cabin settled into a familiar rhythm, the occasional ding of a call button, the rustling of newspapers, and the soft murmur of conversations, the businessman found himself still fixated on the older man. Something about him, his presence, his calmness, his refusal to engage, felt like a challenge. Though the businessman couldn't quite explain why. He crossed one leg over the other, leaned slightly into the aisle, and glanced at the man, who was still staring out the window. The businessman's lips curled into a smirk as he decided to press on. "I'm curious," he said, loud enough for a few nearby passengers to hear. "What brings? Someone like you in first class? Big lottery win? Or are you just here to reminisce about the good old days when planes still ran on propellers?" A few passengers exchanged glances, their discomfort evident, but no one intervened. The older man didn't react immediately. He took a slow, measured breath before turning slightly toward the businessman. For a brief moment, their eyes met. The older man's gaze was steady, unbothered, almost as if he were assessing the younger man's intentions. Then, without saying a word, he turned back to the window, his expression as composed as ever. The lack of reaction only encouraged the businessman. He leaned back in his seat, speaking louder now, his voice dripping with mockery. Not much for conversation, huh? I guess you'd rather sit there reminiscing about the days before Wi-Fi and smartphones. He chuckled to himself, his tone making it clear that he thought he had won whatever imaginary battle he had conjured. Once again, the older man remained silent. He simply folded his hands neatly in his lap and adjusted the cuff of his tan jacket, a subtle movement that seemed to say, "You're not worth my time." Nearby passengers began to shift uncomfortably. A woman in her 50s shot the businessman a disapproving look, while a young couple sitting across the aisle whispered to each other, their eyes darting toward the older man. The tension in the cabin grew thicker, but no one stepped in to stop the scene from escalating. The businessman, oblivious to the discomfort he was causing, turned to a man sitting across the aisle, a fellow professional in a pressed suit. "You know," he began, gesturing toward the older man, "people love to complain about progress, but I can't imagine wanting to go back to their time. No cell phones, no tech, no real innovation. How did they even survive back then?" The man across the aisle gave an uncomfortable chuckle, clearly not wanting to get involved. But the businessman didn't notice, or didn't care. "They always talk about how things were better," he continued, shaking his head, "but it's just nostalgia. The world's moved on. It's better now, no matter what they say." Just then, the flight attendant approached, pushing the beverage cart down the aisle. Her professional smile was slightly strained as she reached the older man's row and leaned down. "Mr. Eastwood," she said warmly, her tone carrying unmistakable respect, "would you like coffee or tea?" The businessman froze. His tablet slipped from his hands onto his lap as the name hit him like a bolt of lightning. Eastwood. His mind raced, disbelief washing over him. Could it be? The older man turned toward the flight attendant and offered her a polite smile. "Coffee. Black, please," he said in a calm, steady voice. The businessman's jaw tightened as he processed the name, the voice, and the face that was now taking shape in his memory. Clint Eastwood. The Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor and director whose reputation preceded him in every room, every space. And here he was, sitting just a row away, quietly enduring the businessman's arrogance. A ripple of whispers began to spread through the cabin as more passengers caught on to the revelation. "Is that really him?" a woman murmured to her husband. "I think it's Clint Eastwood," another passenger whispered excitedly. The businessman's face turned pale as the truth settled in. The man he had been mocking wasn't just another older passenger. He was a Hollywood icon, a figure synonymous with strength, resilience, and wisdom. The gravity of his mistake hit him all at once, leaving him speechless. But the realization wasn't the end of his humiliation. It was only the beginning of a lesson that would unfold in front of the entire cabin. He sat frozen in his seat, the weight of recognition pressing down on him like a lead blanket. Clint Eastwood. The name echoed in his mind as he struggled to connect the dots between the iconic figure he had grown up hearing about and the quiet man in a tan jacket who had absorbed his jabs without a single word of protest. He stole another glance at Eastwood, who was now calmly sipping his coffee, seemingly unaware or simply unbothered by the whispers spreading through the cabin. The ripple of whispers spread through the cabin. Passengers leaned toward one another, their murmurs growing louder as the realization dawned on more and more of them. "That's Clint Eastwood, isn't it?" a woman a few rows back said excitedly to her husband. "Yeah, I'm pretty sure it is," he replied, craning his neck for a better view. The businessman's ears burned as the words reached him. He slumped slightly in his seat, wishing he could somehow disappear into the cushions. The quiet conversations around him only magnified his embarrassment, each one like a tiny spotlight illuminating his foolishness. He clenched his hands around the armrests, his mind racing. How did I not recognize him? How could I have been so blind? But it wasn't just the fact that he hadn't recognized Eastwood, it was the way he had spoken to him. Dismissive, condescending, mocking. He had treated him like an irrelevant relic of the past. And now, the realization of just how wrong he had been felt like a punch to the gut. Finally, he mustered the courage to speak. Leaning slightly forward in his seat, he said, "Excuse me, Mr. Eastwood." His voice was quiet now, hesitant, a far cry from the loud, arrogant tone he had used earlier. Eastwood turned his head slowly, his piercing eyes locking on the businessman's. It wasn't an aggressive look, but it wasn't friendly either. It was the kind of look that stopped people in their tracks, a gaze filled with quiet authority and the wisdom of someone who had seen and endured far more than most could imagine. "Yes," Eastwood said simply, his voice steady and calm. The businessman opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. What was he supposed to say? Sorry for being an ass? Sorry I didn't recognize you? Sorry for treating you like you didn't belong here? None of it felt sufficient. I didn't realize, he stammered, his words trailing off awkwardly. Eastwood raised an eyebrow, waiting. His silence only made the businessman's discomfort grow. I didn't mean to offend you, the businessman finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't realize who you were. For the first time, a flicker of amusement crossed Eastwood's face. He set his coffee cup down on the tray table in front of him and leaned back slightly in his seat. "And if I wasn't who you think I am?" he asked, his tone measured but sharp. The businessman blinked, taken aback. "What do you mean?" Eastwood tilted his head, his gaze never wavering. "If I were just some ordinary guy in a plaid shirt, would that make the way you spoke to me okay?" The businessman's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The question hit him harder than he expected. For a moment, all he could do was sit there, staring at the man he had so arrogantly dismissed. The murmurs in the cabin grew quieter as passengers tuned into the exchange. Even the flight attendants, busy moving through the aisles, slowed their pace, their eyes darting toward Eastwood and the businessman. The businessman swallowed hard, his face flushed with shame. I guess not, he admitted finally, his voice barely audible. Eastwood gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if that was the answer he had expected all along. Then, without another word, he picked up his coffee and turned back toward the window, signaling that for him, the conversation was over. But for the businessman, the moment was far from over. The lesson Eastwood had just delivered, calmly, succinctly, and with more impact than any raised voice or angry retort ever could, hung heavy in the air, and there was no escaping it. The businessman sat stiffly in his seat, his mind still spinning. Clint Eastwood's words were like a mirror, reflecting his arrogance and assumptions back at him. He wanted to apologize again, to find the right words to fix the damage. But his confidence, the very thing he had flaunted earlier, was now nowhere to be found. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he leaned forward again, his voice low and tentative. "Mr. Eastwood, I owe you an apology. I wasn't trying to." Eastwood raised a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. But his expression remained calm. "You don't need to explain," he said, his tone even but firm. "What's done is done, but there's a lesson here if you're willing to hear it." The businessman nodded quickly, his eyes wide, eager to redeem himself. The cabin seemed to quiet, as if even the other passengers were waiting for what Clint Eastwood would say next. Eastwood leaned back slightly, his fingers wrapping loosely around his coffee cup. "People always think respect is something you earn by being someone important, someone with a title or a reputation," he began, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. "But real respect, that's not about who the other person is, it's about who you are." The businessman's breath caught. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Eastwood's words hit him square in the chest, the simplicity of the truth cutting through all the excuses he'd been preparing. "You see," Eastwood continued, his gaze steady, "respect isn't conditional. It's not something you give out based on what someone looks like, what they're wearing, or whether or not you recognize their name. It's about how you carry yourself, how you treat people, even when you think no one's watching." The businessman felt his face flush with shame. He had built his life on success and status, priding himself on being a self-made man. Yet here he was, being schooled on the most basic principle of decency by someone he had so carelessly dismissed. Eastwood took a slow sip of his coffee, then set it back down on the tray table. "I've been around long enough to know that people like to make quick judgments. They think they've got someone figured out the moment they lay eyes on them," he said. Then he gave a slight shake of his head. "But those assumptions, they say more about the person making them than the person they're about." The businessman swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. He wanted to say something, anything, but the weight of his own guilt held him silent. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad," Eastwood said, his tone softening slightly. "I'm telling you because I hope you'll think about it the next time you look at someone and decide they're worth less than you." For a moment, the cabin was completely still. The businessman sat motionless, his eyes fixed on Eastwood, who now turned back toward the window, his demeanor as calm as ever. The businessman's mind raced. He thought of all the times he had dismissed people in his life, co-workers, strangers, even friends, because they didn't fit into his narrow definition of success or relevance. How many opportunities had he missed to connect, to understand, because of his own arrogance? But as he sat there, grappling with the weight of his own behavior, he realized that Eastwood's words weren't just a rebuke, they were an invitation to change. As the flight continued, the businessman remained silent, his thoughts churning with a mix of regret and introspection. The hum of conversation around him seemed distant now, a muffled backdrop to the storm inside his mind. Clint Eastwood's words echoed in his head, each sentence hitting harder the more he replayed them. Respect isn't about who the other person is, it's about who you are. He glanced again at Eastwood, who sat peacefully in his seat, looking out the window as though the entire exchange had been just another moment in a long and storied life. There was no animosity in his expression, no lingering irritation. It was as if the lesson had been given and the older man had moved on, leaving the businessman alone with his thoughts. And those thoughts were relentless. The businessman began to replay not just this interaction, but others, moments from his life where he'd been quick to judge, quick to dismiss. He thought about the intern he had once ridiculed for suggesting an idea he had deemed too inexperienced to understand. Months later, that idea became a cornerstone of the company's success, though the credit had gone to someone else. He thought about the janitor at his office, a man he had never bothered to greet, until the day that same janitor stopped to help him pick up scattered papers after he tripped in the hallway. He thought about colleagues whose opinions he had brushed aside, neighbors whose names he didn't know, strangers whose stories he had never cared to hear. Each memory added to the weight in his chest, a growing realization of how his arrogance and assumptions had shaped his interactions with others. He had built a life on the belief that success and intelligence gave him the right to look down on people, to measure their worth by his own skewed standards. But Eastwood's calm words had shattered that illusion. The businessman shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He wasn't used to feeling small. He prided himself on being in control, on knowing how to command a room. Yet here he was, humbled by a man who hadn't raised his voice, hadn't argued, hadn't done anything but speak the truth. A memory from his childhood surfaced unexpectedly. He remembered his father, a strict but fair man, telling him, "Son, how you treat someone who can't do anything for you says more about your character than anything else." At the time, he had brushed the words aside, too young and self-assured to think they applied to him. But now, sitting in first class with the weight of his own behavior pressing down on him, those words had never felt more relevant. He glanced around the cabin, noticing the quiet admiration others seemed to have for Eastwood. Passengers who had barely looked up from their devices earlier were now stealing glances, whispering among themselves. But Eastwood didn't seem to notice, or perhaps he simply didn't care. His quiet confidence wasn't performative. It wasn't about commanding attention or seeking validation. It was just who he was. The businessman felt a pang of envy, not for Eastwood's fame or success, but for his sense of self. He realized that his own confidence had always been tied to external markers, his job title, his salary, his possessions. Without those things, who was he? Could he still command respect, or would he crumble under the weight of his own insecurities? He looked down at his hands, suddenly aware of how tightly he was gripping the armrests. His knuckles were white, his palms sweaty. Slowly, he released his grip and took a deep breath. There was no undoing what he had said to Eastwood, no erasing the embarrassment of this flight. But there was something he could do. He could learn. For the rest of the flight, the businessman stayed quiet, his mind occupied with the implications of Eastwood's words. He thought about the kind of person he wanted to be, the kind of person who could command respect, not through power or wealth, but through kindness and humility. He didn't know if it was too late to change, but he knew he had to try. And as the plane began its descent, one thing became clear. This wasn't just another flight. It was a turning point, a moment that would stay with him long after the wheels touched the ground. As the landing gear deployed, he felt the familiar jolt. The cabin lights brightened slightly, and the flight attendants made their way through the aisle, checking seatbelts and tray tables. For everyone else, it was just another routine landing. But for the businessman, this flight had been anything but ordinary. He glanced out the window, the Los Angeles skyline coming into view. Normally, the sight would fill him with anticipation, a rush of energy for the meetings, deals, and opportunities waiting for him in the city. But today, it felt different. The skyline wasn't just a destination. It was a reminder of the person he had been when he boarded this flight. A man who had measured success by power and status. A man who had been blind to the flaws in his own character. And now, as the plane touched down smoothly on the runway, he knew that man couldn't be the same person who stepped off this plane. The businessman took a deep breath, trying to steady the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside him. He still felt the weight of Eastwood's words pressing on his chest. Respect isn't about who the other person is, it's about who you are. That simple truth had turned his world upside down, forcing him to confront things he had avoided for years. The cabin filled with the familiar sounds of landing, the soft chime of the seatbelt sign turning off, the rustling of passengers gathering their belongings, and the occasional chatter of those eager to disembark. But the businessman moved more slowly than usual, his hands fumbling slightly as he reached for his briefcase. His mind was too preoccupied to focus on the mundane details of travel. Then he saw Clint Eastwood rise from his seat. The older man moved with deliberate calm, retrieving his modest carry-on bag and slinging it over one shoulder. As he turned to make his way toward the aisle, he paused for a moment, his gaze falling on the businessman. For a brief second, the businessman felt like a child caught doing something wrong. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, Eastwood gave him a small, knowing smile. It wasn't smug, it wasn't dismissive, it was forgiving. "Take care of yourself," Eastwood said quietly, his voice carrying the same steady authority that had silenced the businessman earlier. And with that, he turned and walked toward the exit, leaving the businessman sitting there, stunned. Those simple words, spoken without malice or bitterness, carried more weight than the businessman could have anticipated. It wasn't just a farewell, it was a reminder, an invitation to be better. As the businessman finally stood and shuffled into the aisle, he noticed the way other passengers looked at Eastwood as he passed. There was admiration in their eyes, not just because of who he was, but because of how he carried himself. He didn't demand respect. He earned it, through quiet strength, through dignity. The businessman followed the flow of passengers through the jet bridge and into the bustling terminal. The bright lights and hum of activity felt almost jarring after the introspective quiet of the flight. But as he walked toward baggage claim, the lesson he had learned stayed with him. He thought about all the times he had judged people based on appearances, status, or perceived importance. He thought about the countless opportunities he had missed to connect with others because he had been too wrapped up in his own ego. And he thought about the kind of person he wanted to be moving forward, someone who gave respect freely, not because of what someone could do for him, but because it was simply the right thing to do. When he reached the baggage claim area, he paused for a moment and pulled out his phone. His instinct was to check emails, dive back into work, and bury the uncomfortable feelings of the past few hours. But instead, he opened a blank note and typed 3 simple words. Be like Eastwood. He didn't know what the road ahead would look like, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't go back to being the person he was before. That flight had changed him in ways he couldn't yet fully articulate. Because sometimes the most important lessons don't come from lectures or books. They come from the quiet moments when someone holds up a mirror and forces you to see yourself for who you truly are. As he stepped out of the terminal and into the Los Angeles sun, the businessman felt something he hadn't felt in years: humility. And with that humility came something even more powerful: hope. Hope that he could start again, this time with a heart more open and a mind more willing to listen. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who might need a reminder about the power of respect and humility. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire and challenge us to grow. What would you have done if you were in his shoes? Let us know in the comments below.